My grandfather died on a Tuesday morning in late October, and by Friday afternoon, his attorney had turned my entire life upside down. I was named the sole heir to his $4.8 million estate, his ranch, and his construction company. My father and uncle exploded. They gave me one night to sign it all over. When I refused, my father told me to get out of his house and never come back. I drove to my grandfather's ranch with nothing but a duffel bag and an old pocket watch he had pressed into my hand 2 months before he died. I thought I'd finally found a safe place to breathe. But the next morning, when my father and uncle rolled through the front gate with a lawyer and a sheriff's deputy in tow, they stopped dead in their tracks the moment they saw who was already standing on that porch beside me. My name is Caleb Doran. This is not just a story about money. It's about the kind of love that plans ahead, the kind of betrayal that wears a smile, and the last act of a man who knew exactly what his family would do the moment he was gone. Before I tell you everything, I want to ask you something. Can you drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from? I read every single one. It means more than you know to hear from people who understand that sometimes the ones who are supposed to protect you are the ones you have to protect yourself from. And if this story connects with you, please subscribe. Every person who joins this channel is proof that honesty still matters. I was 29 years old and teaching art at a middle school in Beaumont, Texas, when my grandfather passed. My apartment was a one-bedroom place with a leaky kitchen faucet and a view of a parking garage. I drove a 10-year-old truck with a cracked dashboard, and most Fridays I ate cereal for dinner because payday was still a week away. My father, my uncle, and my cousin lived a very different kind of life. My father ran the business side of my grandfather's construction company, pulling a salary that covered a house in a gated community, a boat, and 2 new cars every 3 years. My uncle managed property acquisitions and had a taste for expensive watches and golf memberships he never used. My cousin, who was 24 and had never held a real job, drove the car my grandfather had bought him and spent most of his time convinced he was about to launch some business idea that never got past a conversation. None of them visited my grandfather much. I visited every chance I got. Every other weekend I drove the 40 minutes out to his ranch in Hardin County. We'd sit on the back porch in the evenings, watching the tree line go dark while he talked about the early days, about building the company from a single flatbed truck and a handshake loan, about my grandmother who died before I was old enough to remember her well. He taught me to fix a fence post properly, how to read the sky before a storm, how to sit with silence without needing to fill it. He was the one person in my family who never made me feel like a disappointment for choosing a teacher's salary over a corner office. 2 months before he died on a Sunday afternoon in late August, he walked me out to his truck before I left and pressed something into my palm. It was his pocket watch. Brass, worn smooth at the edges with his initials engraved on the back. He had carried it every day for 50 years. "I want you to have this now," he said, closing my fingers around it. "While I can still see you hold it." I told him that was a dramatic thing to say. He smiled at that, the way he always did when he knew something I didn't, and told me to drive safe. 6 weeks later, he was gone. A heart attack in his sleep, at the ranch he had built with his own hands. The ranch foreman found him in the morning. The funeral was held in Beaumont at a church he had attended for 40 years. My father spent most of the service on his phone in the vestibule. My uncle stood with a cluster of business contacts near the door, speaking in low voices about assets and timelines like they were waiting for a meeting to start. My cousin sat in the back row and left early. I sat in the front pew beside my grandfather's longtime housekeeper, a woman named Dolores who had worked for him for 18 years, and I held the pocket watch in my coat pocket the whole time because I needed something solid to hold on to. At the graveside, a woman I didn't recognize stood at a respectful distance from the family. She was in her 60s, dressed plainly, with sharp eyes that found mine once and held them for a moment before she looked away. I didn't know her then. I would learn her name soon enough. My grandfather's attorney, a man named Robert Fitch, who had represented him for over 2 decades, reached me as people were beginning to drift toward their cars. He was a compact man, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the calm, unhurried manner of someone who has delivered difficult news before. "Thursday morning," he said quietly. "My office on Calder Avenue. 9 o'clock. Your grandfather left specific instructions for the reading." He paused. "All of the family will be there. I want you to know beforehand that what I'll read Thursday is going to be a surprise to most people in that room." I asked him what he meant. He just said, "Drive safe, Caleb," and walked to his car. I didn't sleep well the next 3 nights. Thursday morning arrived, gray and heavy with humidity. My father and uncle were already seated when I walked into Robert's conference room, their own attorney beside them, a man I had never met who immediately made me feel like I had wandered into the wrong meeting. My cousin slouched in a chair near the window. My father gave me a short nod. My uncle didn't look at me at all. Robert closed the door, set his glasses on his nose, and opened the folder on the table in front of him. He read the will in a steady, measured voice. My grandfather had been of sound mind, had undergone 2 independent evaluations in the past year, and had revised his will 14 months prior. Everything he owned, the ranch, the construction company shares, the investment accounts, the property holdings, the full estate valued at approximately $4.8 million was left in its entirety to me. The room didn't freeze. It detonated. My father was on his feet before Robert finished the sentence. My uncle's face went a color I had never seen on a person before, somewhere between white and red at the same time. My cousin said something that I won't repeat. Their attorney immediately started talking about challenges and grounds and timelines. My father pointed at me across the table like I had done something to him personally, his voice rising in a way I had never heard before, not even when I was a kid and he was at his worst. Robert did not raise his voice, he simply waited. When the noise dropped enough for him to be heard, he said that my grandfather had anticipated this response, and that there was a message he had asked to be played for the family at this moment. He turned his laptop toward the room. The screen showed my grandfather sitting in the leather chair behind his desk at the ranch, the window behind him showing the back pasture in full afternoon light. He looked tired but clear-eyed. "If you're watching this," he said, "then I'm gone, and I imagine there's some noise in that room right now." He paused and almost smiled. "I want to speak plainly. I have provided for my son and my brother generously over the course of my life. I have funded businesses, covered debts, made introductions, and asked for nothing in return except honesty. What I received instead was entitlement. Caleb is the only person in my immediate family who visited me because he wanted to be there, not because he wanted something. He is the only one I trust to carry what I built with the respect it deserves. This decision is not impulsive. It is the only one I trust to carry what I built with the respect it deserves. This decision is not impulsive. It is the most considered decision I have made in here. You already know what I want you to do with it. Don't let them rattle you, and don't sign anything." The recording ended. My father's voice came back louder than before. My uncle stood and said several things to Robert that I won't repeat either. Through all of it, I sat still, my hand wrapped around the pocket watch in my coat pocket, and I let the noise wash past me like water around a rock. Then Robert said something that stopped every person in that room. "There is a protective provision in the estate documents," he said, "designed by your grandfather and witnessed by 2 independent attorneys. In the event that Caleb, under any form of pressure or coercion, transfers control of the estate within 12 months of the reading, all assets will bypass any recipient and be donated in full to a veterans housing nonprofit your grandfather designated. The estate cannot be extracted from Caleb through force. If he is pressured into signing, no one in this family receives anything." My uncle sat down slowly. My father stared at Robert for a long moment, then he turned and stared at me, and his expression shifted from fury into something colder. "Tonight," he said, 7 o'clock, the house. That night I drove to my parents' house in the gated community, with the kind of dread that sits low in your stomach and gonady, with the kind of dread that sits low in your stomach and doesn't move. The house was all lit up. My uncle's car was in the driveway. Their attorney was there too, seated at the dining room table with documents spread across the polished surface. My father spoke first. He was calm in the way that people are calm when they've decided something or just waiting for you to agree with it. He said that the family had discussed the situation and that there was a reasonable path forward. I would sign a transfer of management rights, not ownership, just management, and in exchange I would receive a monthly stipend and full health insurance for life. He said it like he was doing me a favor. He said it like I should be grateful. I looked at the documents on the table. I looked at my uncle who was examining his fingernails. I looked at my uncle who was examining his fingernails. I looked at my mother who had not made eye contact with me since I walked in the door. "I'm not signing," I said. My father's composure lasted about 4 more seconds. What followed was the worst conversation of my life. My mother told me I was ungrateful for everything they had done for me, every school year, every opportunity, every roof over my head. My uncle said my grandfather had clearly not been thinking straight in his final months. My cousin told me I didn't deserve it and never had. My father said that if I walked out of that house without signing, I was no longer his son. He said the words clearly, without hesitation, like they had been rehearsed. I stood up. I went upstairs to the room I had grown up in. The trophies from a couple of baseball seasons I barely remembered. A poster I'd had since I was 16. I took the one box from the closet shelf that had things in it I actually cared about. A few photographs, a sketchbook, a letter my grandfather had written me when I graduated college. I came back downstairs with the box under my arm. My father was standing at the bottom of the stairs. He didn't move. "You walk out that door," he said, "and you're on your own." "I've been on my own," I told him. I just didn't realize it until now. I walked out into the night air. My father didn't follow me to the door. My mother called something after me that I couldn't make out over the sound of it shutting behind me. I sat in my truck in the driveway for a minute, watching the porch light. Then I pulled the pocket watch out of my coat pocket and held it in my palm. The metal was warm from being carried close all day. I thought about my grandfather sitting across from me on that back porch, talking about the early days, about what things were worth fighting for and what things weren't. I put the truck in reverse. The drive out to the ranch in Hardin County took just under an hour. The road narrowed the further I got from town, the tree line pressing in on both sides, the sky opening up above the highway into a vault of stars that you simply cannot see from inside a city. By the time I turned onto the gravel road that led to the property, something in my chest had gone quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. The particular quiet of a decision already made. The house was dark when I pulled up. I tried the front door. Locked. I went around to the side gate and tried the small brass key Robert had slipped into my hand before I left his office Thursday morning, a key he said my grandfather had specified should go to me immediately after the reading. The gate swung open. The key worked on the back door as well. Inside, the house smelled exactly the way it always had. Cedar and leather and the faint trace of coffee that seemed to have soaked into the walls over decades. I turned on the lamp in the sitting room and stood there for a minute just breathing the air. Then I found a blanket and the couch, and I slept better than I had in a week. The next morning I was sitting on the back porch with coffee when a truck came up the gravel road. My stomach tightened. But when the door opened, it was a man I recognized. His name was Eddie Crane, and he had been the head ranch hand at the property for 11 years. He was in his early 50s, deliberate in his movements, with a weathered face and the particular economy of speech that comes from spending most of your life outdoors. He walked up to the porch and looked at me with no particular surprise. "Figured you'd be here," he said. "Your grandfather told me you'd come." He sat in the other chair and told me what he knew. My grandfather had spoken to him privately 3 months before he died. He told Eddie that when he passed, someone would try to take the property and that Eddie should be there for me when I arrived. He didn't tell Eddie everything, but he told him enough. He trusted you, Eddie said. He talked about you every time you left. Said you were the only one who came out here just to sit with him. I had to look at the tree line for a minute before I could respond. By mid-morning, Robert Fitch arrived. He had driven out without being asked, which told me everything about what kind of person he was. He carried 2 folders and set them on the kitchen table. "Your grandfather prepared for this," he said. "There's a reserve account, separate from the estate, set aside specifically for legal defense and property security. 12 months of coverage. He wanted you to have room to stand your ground before they came at you in full. 12 months. My grandfather, even from wherever he had gone, had given me a year to get my footing." Robert also brought something else, a sealed letter, my grandfather's handwriting on the outside. He said it had been left with instructions that I receive it privately after I had come to the ranch pocket and waited until Robert stepped outside to make a call. I opened the letter at the kitchen table. My grandfather's handwriting was large and slightly uneven, the way it had gotten in the last year or so. "Caleb, if you're reading this, you did the right thing. You didn't sign. I knew you wouldn't. There are people coming to you in the next few days who I asked to be there. Trust them. They will bring you things you need to know. There is also something you need to find. Look in the top drawer of my desk in the study. I left you one more thing." I went to the study. The top drawer of his desk held the usual clutter: pens, a notepad, a small flashlight, and underneath everything, a slim key on a plain ring with a paper tag. The tag read, "File cabinet, bottom drawer, red folder." Inside the red folder were 18 months of records. Documented requests from my father and uncle for loans and advances against the company accounts. My grandfather's handwritten notes alongside each one, some denied, and why. The total extended to my father's household alone was over $340,000. Below that folder was a second one, marked simply with my name. Inside was a different kind of record. Dates and short notes. Caleb visited. We walked the south pasture. He asked nothing. Page after page of those small notations, spanning 7 years. He had kept a record of every visit. I sat on the floor of that study for a long time. That afternoon, a woman knocked at the front door. She was the woman I had noticed at the graveside, mid-60s, composed with the particular bearing of someone who has held difficult positions for a long time. Her name was Patricia Oakes. She had been my grandfather's accountant for 14 years, handling the company's books and his personal finances. She'd driven out from Beaumont with a laptop and 2 printed reports. "Your grandfather asked me to come to you if the family contested the will," she said, setting the reports on the kitchen table. "He wanted you to know what the company actually looks like and what they've taken out of it." The numbers she showed me were not small. Over 4 years under my father's signature, there had been a pattern of withdrawals and reclassifications that moved company funds into accounts that were technically traceable to personal expenses. None of it had been hidden exactly, just buried deep enough that no one would look unless they knew where to look. "Your father knew the estate was going to be audited once the will was read," Patricia said. "He's been moving fast since October." That evening, around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. The message was 4 lines. "The person helping your family isn't someone you'd expect. They've been inside the ranch property since the funeral. Don't tell everyone what you know yet. Someone at that table is not what they seem." I read the message 3 times. I looked at the names of the people who had come to me that day. Robert, Eddie, Patricia. I had welcomed all of them without hesitation because my grandfather had pointed me toward them. But the message was unambiguous. One of them was not there for me. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I walked the ranch alone at first light, thinking. Eddie was already out by the equipment barn when I came around the side of the house, doing maintenance on one of the trucks. He waved when he saw me. I waved back. I kept walking. When I came back inside, I went to the security panel my grandfather had installed near the back door, a simple camera system covering the gate, the driveway, the barn, and both sides of the house. Robert had showed me the access the night before. I pulled up the footage from the past 5 days. I found it on the 3rd day back. The evening of the funeral, after everyone had gone, there was 40 minutes of footage showing a figure crossing the back field from the far fence line, moving toward the equipment barn. The angle was poor and the light was almost gone, but the figure was inside the barn for 22 minutes before leaving the same way they came. I didn't recognize the figure, but I recognized the jacket. I had seen it that same afternoon at the funeral, from 3 feet away. It belonged to a man I had met only once, my uncle's property manager, a younger man who had come to the graveside service uninvited and stood at the back of the crowd. I had thought nothing of it at the time. I called Robert immediately. He arrived within the hour and watched the footage twice. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked me who else knew about the reserve account and a protective clause. "Just the people in the room on Thursday," I said. He nodded slowly. "Your uncle's property manager has been doing freelance work for several people associated with your father's business for about 2 years. I didn't put it together until this moment." He paused. "Your grandfather suspected there might be someone feeding information to your family from close in. He warned me once. I should have moved faster on it." He made 2 phone calls. I sat at the kitchen table with the red folder in front of me and the pocket watch in my hand and waited. 2 days later, my father arrived. I watched from the security monitor as the vehicles came up the gravel road. My father's truck. My uncle's SUV. A third car I didn't recognize with a small legal services logo on the door. And behind them, a county sheriff's vehicle. They came through the front gate in a formation that was meant to look decisive. My father walked at the front, his attorney at his shoulder, carrying a briefcase in a folder that I could see from the porch held a set of documents with a lot of paper in them. He stopped at the base of the porch steps. He looked up at the people standing behind me. Robert on my right, Eddie on my left, Patricia in the doorway, and a woman I had met only the day before but who had driven out that morning from Beaumont specifically for this moment. Her name was Judge Constance Ardmore, retired, who had served on the county bench for 16 years and whom my grandfather had contacted personally 8 months before his death to ask if she would serve as an independent overseer of the estate. She had agreed. She was standing in the doorway of his ranch house with her arms folded, watching my father with an expression that communicated in a single look exactly how much weight his folder carried. My father's attorney opened his mouth. Robert got there first. "Before you begin," Robert said, "you should know that everything on this property has been under recorded surveillance for the past 10 days. Any trespass, any unlawful entry, any attempt to remove or alter property is documented. You should also know that your property manager's access to this ranch on the night of October 24th has been preserved and will be submitted to the appropriate authorities." My father's face changed. My uncle took a half step back. The attorney looked down at his folder and said nothing. Then my father looked at me, and for a moment all the calculation dropped out of his face, and what was underneath it was something I recognized from childhood. Not remorse. Frustration. The frustration of a person who has always gotten his way and cannot understand why the rules have changed. "This isn't what he would have wanted," my father said, tearing the family apart. I looked at him from the porch of the house where I had spent more real time with my grandfather than my father had in a decade, holding a pocket watch that my grandfather had placed in my hand while he was still alive so he could watch me receive it. "He left very clear instructions about what he wanted," I said. "You were in that room when Robert read them." My uncle said something sharp. My father cut him off with a gesture. "He looked at Ardmore when Robert read them." My uncle said something sharp. My father She looked back at him without expression. He gathered the folder from his attorney's hands, turned, and walked back to his truck. My uncle followed. The attorney followed. The sheriff's deputy, who'd said nothing at all during the entire exchange, gave Robert a small nod and got back in his vehicle. I watched the convoy move back down the gravel road and turn onto the county highway. I watched until the dust settled and the sound of the engines faded into the tree line. Then I sat down on the porch steps and just breathed for a minute. Eddie put a hand on my shoulder briefly and went back to the barn. Patricia went inside. Robert sat in the other chair and started making notes. The legal process that followed took 4 months. My father and uncle filed a formal challenge to the will on the grounds of undue influence, claiming my grandfather had not been fully competent when he revised his estate documents. Robert had anticipated this. The 2 independent medical evaluations my grandfather had undergone were clean. The timestamps on the will revision were clean. The record my grandfather had kept, the notations about every visit, every conversation, every request denied and why, was exactly what Robert needed. Patricia's financial documentation was submitted as evidence of why the estate had been structured the way it had. My grandfather's video message was entered into the record. The judge reviewed everything and ruled in my favor in February. The will stood. The challenge was dismissed. My uncle's property manager, the one caught on camera, was quietly let go from his position and referred for a separate inquiry regarding unauthorized access to private property. My father and uncle did not appeal. I was sitting in Robert's office when he told me the ruling had come through, and my first feeling was not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated. The particular exhaustion that comes after a long time of standing braced for impact, and the strange lightness when the impact finally stopped coming. That spring, I moved to the ranch. I kept my teaching position for 1 more semester and finished out the school year. By summer, I was living full-time in Hardin County, learning the parts of the property and the company I didn't yet know, relying heavily on Robert and Patricia and the small circle of people my grandfather had trusted. I hired a proper operations manager for the construction company, a woman with 20 years in the industry who had once interviewed for a position there long ago and whom my grandfather had mentioned to me once as someone he had always respected. I established the Doran Family Foundation in my grandfather's name that fall. The initial endowment was $1.2 million, directed toward vocational training programs in East Texas for young people who couldn't afford traditional 4-year colleges. It was not what my grandfather had explicitly asked for, but when I thought about who he was, a man who built something real with his hands from nothing, it felt right in the way that very few decisions have felt right to me in my life. I did not hear from my father for 8 months after the ruling. When he did call in late October, it was a short conversation. He said he hoped things were going well. I said they were. There was a pause that had a year of history in it. He said he'd been thinking. I said I had been too. We didn't resolve anything, but the call was made, and I think we both knew it was the beginning of something slower and less certain than reconciliation, something more like 2 people deciding not to be strangers. My uncle, I have not spoken to since February. On a Sunday morning in November, close to a year after my grandfather died, I drove out to the cemetery in Beaumont and sat for a while at his grave. I had brought white flowers because Dolores had told me once that he always bought white flowers for my grandmother's grave, never any other color. I told him about the foundation. I told him about the company and what I was learning and where I was struggling. I told him about a few of the students I'd had in my last semester of teaching, kids who reminded me of myself at 12, drawing in the margins of every notebook. I told him I was doing my best. The wind off the Gulf came through the trees and moved through the grass, and then was still. That afternoon I drove back to the ranch and sat at the upright piano in the front room, an old instrument that had been there since before my grandfather bought the property. I had played piano for a few years as a kid, not seriously, and he had known that. He had told me once to play it when I needed to think. I hadn't touched it until that day. I sat there for a while with my hands in my lap. Then I opened the bench and found, beneath a stack of old sheet music, an envelope with my name on it in his handwriting. I recognized the paper, the same stationery as the letter Robert had given me. Inside was a single card. 3 lines. You did it. I knew you would. Now build something that lasts. I don't know when he put it there. I don't know how far ahead he had planned or how certain he was that I would sit at this piano on some afternoon and find it. What I know is that the man spent the last year of his life making sure that the one person in his family who showed up for the right reasons would be protected and provided for and not alone. I held the card for a long time. Then I set it on top of the piano, put my hands on the keys, and played the only song I still remembered from when I was 12 years old. Slow and a little unsteady at first, then more certain as the notes came back. The sound filled the front room and moved out into the hallway, and I kept playing until I reached the end. And when I finished, I sat quietly and listened to the silence that came after, and it felt like the most complete silence I'd ever heard in my life. My grandfather always said that what you leave behind matters more than what you accumulate. He said it in different ways at different times, sitting on that back porch while the sky went dark, and I used to nod and think I understood him. I understand him better now. The pocket watch is on the desk in the study where I work in the evenings. I can see it from where I sit. The brass is worn smooth at the edges from 50 years of being carried close, and the initials on the back are still sharp. Some things hold,